In this lesson, we're going to finish compositing our rendered passes together using Photoshop. So, picking up now where we left off from the previous lesson, you can see we now have the occlusion in place, as well as now we've replaced this background with something a little bit more interesting. So now let's come in and start to add some depth of field effects. And this is where our depth pass comes in. So just like with our occlusion pass, we'll press Control A to select everything, Control C to copy this, and now we'll actually paste this depth pass into our alpha channel. And we'll see why here in just a moment. So with our alpha channel selected, now that we really don't need this anymore, we'll just select it, press Control V to paste this in, and that will override our alpha channel with this depth pass, as you can see here. Now, in order to utilize this depth pass, we need to rely on a filter called the lens blur. Now, one thing that we need to do before we can actually use this lens blur is we're going to have to take all of the different elements that we have right now, this occlusion pass, the color pass, and the background, and merge all of these together. Otherwise, if we start to do the depth of field effect, it'll only apply the depth of field to whatever layer we currently have selected. So we're going to take everything and merge it down. So with one of these layers selected, we can just simply press Control-Shift-E, and now that will just take all of our different layers, merge those all together, since we really don't need our individual layers anymore. So now, with all of these merged together, we'll go to Filter, Blur, and use the Lens Blur. There we go. Now for our source, we can set this to a few different things. We can set it to no source, which will blur everything equally. We could use some kind of a transparency mask or a layer mask. But in our case, we're going to set this to use the source as alpha 1. So that's why we had to take our depth pass and then paste that into the alpha channel. So that way it can now read that depth information in. So as far as adjusting the focal distance, we can come in and start to adjust this until the area that we want comes into focus. So you can see now with this set to a sort of a medium value that these areas that are roughly in the center of our depth start to come a little bit more into focus. As we begin to shift this a little bit further toward the far end of the spectrum, you can see how these areas that are closer to the camera start to become a little bit more focused. Now, rather than using this method, I actually prefer to just simply click anywhere on our image, and you'll notice that that is the area that will now come into focus. So if I click here on this leg, once I click, that area comes into focus, and this will become a little bit easier to see if we were to increase this radius. So you can see how this is now in focus. If I were to click somewhere on the head, you can see how that area comes into focus. Or if I were to click on this background, you can see how that comes into focus. Alright, so let's try to find sort of this medium area. I'll click right here on this tongue. There we go. Now, you can see that even though I'm clicking on this, that we do still have some areas that are still pretty out of focus. You can see that the focusing or the blurring happens pretty rapidly. So I'm going to begin taking this radius down to something that's a little bit more manageable, and that way we just get a little bit more subtle effect here. There we go. So once we have this in place, we can press OK, and there we go. Now we have just a little bit more of a depth of field effect. If you compare what we had before by just pressing Control-Z to what we have now, you can see how it just kind of adds just a little bit more of an interesting effect. So looking at this now, one of the things that I kind of would like to change is the actual corners of his mouth are not quite as sharp as I would like them to be. So at this point, we could go all the way back to ZBrush, fix the geometry, then start to bring this all the way back into Maya, do all the rendering all over again, just to get this at the level that we would want. Now in my case, I'm going to just use some of the tools that we have here in Photoshop as a way of fixing that. So what I'm going to do is go to Liquify, and we can zoom in on the area that we want, and we can just simply take our push tool or our push operator, set our brush size, and then start to come in and just kind of warp some of these areas around. Now that's obviously way too much. So if we needed to come in and protect some of these areas, we can use our freeze tool, and what that'll do is just kind of let us mask out some of these areas around the eye and things like that. So as I'm starting to push, we can make sure that the blurring does not happen anywhere in these frozen areas. So I'll probably come in and just also freeze areas like this bottom part of the lip here. There we go. And again, I'll go back now to my push tool, and we can come in. Just simply start to pull some of these areas back a little bit. Just kind of smudge these into place. And maybe do the same thing down here. Just taking some of these areas and just kind of pushing them in a little bit, giving them a little bit sharper pinch. There we go. Excellent. So that will now kind of bring the corners of his mouth up a little bit higher. Just give him a little bit more of that kind of a enjoyable smile there. And once we're done, just press OK. All right, so there we go. That was much, much faster than going all the way back to ZBrush and doing that work all over again. So I know plenty of people who kind of take the approach of somehow taking this into Photoshop and using these tools as a way of retouching your images, somehow the equivalent of cheating on your renders. And really, you should not think of it as that way. It's really just using the tools that you have at your disposal and leveraging those as a way of getting the job done as effectively and as efficiently as possible, as we've just illustrated here. So that's a look at now how we can start to take these different render layers, bring them all back together using Photoshop, and then just use a couple of quick image editing tools as a way of getting the result exactly how we want it. So this will now bring us to the conclusion of our training on character and scene development in ZBrush. So over the course of the last few hours, we've explored a number of tools in both ZBrush and in Maya for modeling, sculpting, texturing, lighting, rendering, and compositing a character and scene from start to finish. So Justin started out in ZBrush, just using a simple sketch as the inspiration for our character. From there, he walked you through the process of creating a Z-sphere skeleton, posing the character, sculpting highly intricate detail, polypainting textures, and exporting the maps and geometry back over into Maya. Now from there, we looked at how we could use Mental Ray to set up subsurface scattering effects, as well as creating an interesting three-point light setup. We looked at how we could apply displacement and normal maps to recover our high-definition detail from ZBrush. We've seen how we can render out our scene in multiple passes, as well as composite them all back together using Photoshop in order to achieve a final rendered image that is really of much, much better quality than what we would be able to get just strictly out of Mental Ray alone. So to continue your education and expand your skill set, I would encourage you to visit us online, where you'll find all the latest announcements. Built on educational values, Digital Tutors started with a simple vision in mind, to help new and experienced artists become more productive by learning new software and production techniques. We've been a leading online resource for free video-based training and have been instrumental in aiding millions of artists on a daily basis. Learn more about the multitude of training solutions that we offer for various areas of the production pipeline at digitaltutors.com.